Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever looked at a country that holds elections, but something just feels off? Where you kind of get the sense that the winner is already decided? Well, today we are diving deep into that exact gray area, a confusing but really common type of government that sits somewhere between a real democracy and an outright dictatorship. So let's start with a puzzle. You see these countries all over the world that, on the surface, look like they're playing by the democratic rulebook. They have elections, opposition parties exist, people can debate things. So what's the catch? Well, the problem is they're just so hard to pin down. I mean, they're not like a classic dictatorship where political competition is totally impossible, but they're definitely not full-blown democracies either. They live in this weird political twilight zone. Think about it like this. On one hand, you have all the decorations of democracy, elections, campaigns, different parties. But on the other hand, anyone who criticizes the government gets harassed, the media gets muzzled, and the ruling party treats the country's money like its own personal piggy bank. It's a system that's basically at war with itself. This quote from a former president of Kenya just says it all, doesn't it? He's not even trying to hide it. He's basically boasting about how unfair the system is. The game is rigged, and he's telling you it's rigged on purpose. It's not a bug, it's a feature. For the longest time, the experts kind of thought these countries were just transitional democracies, that they were on a slow, bumpy road, but they were heading towards freedom. But here we are, decades later, and a lot of them haven't transitioned anywhere. This isn't just a phase. For them, it's the destination. So if it's not a flawed democracy in transition, what do we actually call this thing? Well, two political scientists, Levitsky and Way, gave it a name: competitive authoritarianism. Let's break down what that really means. Okay, the most important part of that definition is that the competition is real, but it is fundamentally rigged. The opposition isn't just there for show. They can actually fight for power. And hey, sometimes they even win. But they have to do it while playing a brutally uphill battle on a field that is tilted against them from the start. This table really helps lay it all out. On one end, you've got full democracy, free elections, a level playing field. On the complete other end, you've got a closed dictatorship where there's no real competition at all. Competitive authoritarianism is that messy, complicated middle ground where, yeah, there's a contest, but it is not fair, and people's basic rights often get trampled. All right, so how exactly do these rulers rig the game? How do they make sure the field is so uneven? Well, they focus their efforts on three key areas to keep their advantage locked down. First up, the elections themselves. Look, they're not a total sham, but they are so far from being fair. We're talking about voter intimidation, maybe a little ballot stuffing here and there, messing with the voter lists. The goal is to cheat just enough to win, but not so much that people give up and stop voting entirely. See, they still have to manage public opinion. They can't just ignore it. This analogy, which was originally used to describe an election in Mexico, is just perfect. Imagine that. The other team is on the field, they're playing the game, but they're shooting at a tiny goal while you've got a massive one, and the ref is on your team. How can you possibly win? The second major battleground is civil liberties. Sure, the Constitution might say you have freedom of speech, but in reality, speaking out against the government is a risky business. And the harassment is often really subtle. It's not always about throwing people in jail. It's about using things like targeted tax audits or fake lawsuits to bankrupt them and shut them up. And that brings us to the third area, which is honestly the most important one: the abuse of state power. This is where the incumbent government really flexes its muscles. They use state resources, the media, and even the courts as weapons to absolutely crush their opponents. Let's just take money, for example. The party in power uses government cash, government cars, government workers, all for its own campaigns. And the spending difference can be absolutely insane. In one election in Mexico, the ruling party outspent its two biggest rivals by 20-1. How do you even start to compete against that? And then you've got the media. In some places, the government just owns all the major TV and radio stations, easy peasy. In others, it's a bit sneakier. All the private media outlets are owned by the ruler's buddies. In Ukraine, it was discovered the president's office used to send out these secret memos, they were called temniki, telling news editors exactly how to cover the day's events. And finally, the law itself becomes a weapon. Rulers will stack the courts with loyalists. They'll use partisan electoral commissions to disqualify their opponents. And they'll use things like tax laws to target their critics. I mean, the famous case of the Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who got thrown in prison right after he started funding opposition parties, is a textbook example of this playbook.
So the big question is, how did this type of government get so popular all of a sudden? Well, it's a story that really kicks off at one very specific moment in history.
Right after the Cold War ended, a couple of huge things changed. First, the US and the Soviet Union pretty much stopped writing blank checks to their favorite dictators around the world. And second, Western governments started putting a ton of pressure on countries to hold real multi-party elections. All of a sudden, being an old-school dictator was just bad for business. And the result? A massive explosion of these hybrid governments. By 1995, there were at least 36 of them scattered across the globe. It was a new world. You had to look like a democracy to get a seat at the international table, but you didn't actually have to be one. But what happens to these regimes in the long run? Why do some of them eventually democratize, while others just get more authoritarian? Well, Levitsky and Way's theory says it comes down to two key international forces. The first one is what they call leverage. That's basically how much the West can push a country around using tools like sanctions or threatening to cut off aid. The second is linkage, and that's all about how connected a country is to the West through things like trade, tourism, and media. And this table right here, this shows the core prediction of their theory. When a country has really strong ties to the West and it's vulnerable to Western pressure, think Central Europe after the Cold War, it's very likely to become a real democracy. But when both of those things are weak, like in parts of the old Soviet Union, you end up with a stable authoritarian regime. To explain what happens when that international pressure is weak, the authors use a fantastic analogy, the three little pigs. In their story, the democratic opposition is the big bad wolf. If the wolf isn't very strong, the whole story depends on how strong the pig's house is, and the house is the ruling regime. If a regime has a powerful, unified ruling party and tight control, it's like the house of bricks. It's just really, really hard to blow down. So the next time you're watching the news and you see a country holding elections that seem both real and completely rigged at the same time, you'll know exactly what to call it. It's not just a flawed democracy. It's a competitive authoritarian regime, and they are playing a totally different game. The question I'll leave you with is, where do you see this happening in the world today?